So at the outset, I'm going to say this is going to be a series. I'm going to do a number of videos about Lord of the Rings. I haven't read this book series in 18 years, and I think when I was like 9 or 10, that probably wasn't that good a time in my life to really make a judgment as to the quality and the themes and that kind of thing. So I'll be doing a bunch of videos just as I'm going through periodically, like when I'm like half done a book, or I'm done one of the sub books within the books, or I'm done a particular book, or just if I have a particular thought as to the themes or what's going on or kind of the culture. So I'll probably do a lot of videos on Lord of the Rings coming up. I'm going to just come out and say it's not a lore I'm particularly familiar with. Like, the lores I'm familiar with are Dune, Star Wars, A Song of Ice and Fire, Evangelion, Naruto, stuff like that. I'm very familiar with these lores. Lord of the Rings, I don't really know much beyond the movies, the trilogy, and just some things fans have and just friends of mine have told me over the years. So to start off with, the thing that always really struck me as being fascinating about this series is how broad the fan base is. I can't really think of anything else that has a fan base as broad as Lord of the Rings. Like when I was in university, Lord of the Rings was huge because it's always huge in like nerd communities. And you'd have people who would be like reading the God Delusion while like having like a One Ring replica around their neck on a chain, or like wearing their Lord of the Rings t-shirts or something like that. So you'll have people from like all across the political spectrum. You'll have like extremely traditionalist Catholics or very conservative Protestants, but then you'll also have very atheistic, neo-pagan, etc. So like you'll have people as disparate as like Varg and Benjamin Weicker, and you just have a whole bunch of like people across the board who like this series. So that I think is very interesting about it. Also, just kind of there's that expression that Western philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And I guess you could argue that like Western fantasy is kind of a series of footnotes to Tolkien. The fact that like high fantasy is basically just how similar something is to Lord of the Rings. Although ironically, I would actually call the Lord of the Rings very low fantasy, but we'll get into that at some other point in time. It is really interesting. There's very few kind of works of anything that rise to kind of this level of popularity and this level of kind of like pop cultural significance. So it's just very interesting how broad the viewer base is. So that being said, for this first video, let's just talk about it, a bit about what my background is with the Lord of the Rings books. So as I've said in the past, I have a learning disability where I actually have a pretty high overall IQ, but my performance IQ, I think is the term for it, is a lot lower. In particular, my spatial motor skills are really poor. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's like when I took the test, I got like 99.99 in terms of like overall IQ. But like in terms of performance IQ, like things like writing or spelling or that kind of thing, I got like 11 percentile. The point being that I learned to read very late. I learned to read at about grade 2. I had a teacher who was just very strict and adamant, and she just sat me down and she just basically drilled it into me until I was able to read properly. And then within 2 years, I decided to read the Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit. I started off with The Hobbit, and then I read the Lord of the Rings. And I liked The Hobbit. It was a fun little book. It's much easier. It's much more reader friendly than the Lord of the Rings is. It's much more of kind of, I don't know if you want to say like almost like a Victorian era, like an H. Rider Haggard or like a Jules Verne or something like that. Kind of a more traditional Victorian style adventure story. So I like The Hobbit quite a bit. And then I came to Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, I gotta read Lord of the Rings because I want to show that I'm a big boy. I want to show that I'm an adult, so I'm going to read the adult series. So I started reading Lord of the Rings, and it was an interesting experience, to say the least. Now, I have a reputation in these circles. I don't know if I have a reputation, but I like to pretend that I do. I have a reputation in these circles for being very critical of Tolkien. Because compared to most people in these circles who are massive Tolkien fans, I didn't really enjoy it that much when I was reading the books for the first time. And it's kind of funny because as I started rereading them, the first couple chapters, I'm like, wow, this is really good. I'm liking this. I liking Bilbo's birthday. I like the backstory. I like when Frodo's interacting with Gandalf. I like the Smeagol story. I'm like, maybe I was completely wrong about this. Maybe like I was just a kid. I just couldn't focus, and I had trouble with these books, and it wasn't the book's fault. It was just me. And then we get into the, I don't know where it is, the Old Forest or something, and it just goes on. And it's like they're constantly talking about like the logistics of Frodo moving. They're constantly talking about like bathing and like eating, and they have like the same thing happen multiple times. Like there's like Farmer Maggot, and then like they stay the night with him, and then they stay the night with Tom Bombadil. Like Tom Bombadil, what the hell, man? I knew it was going to be bad, like going into this, because it's kind of a meme like with some of my friends just to make fun of Tom Bombadil, and there was like a couple people who really complained that Tom Bombadil wasn't in the movies, so I knew it was going to be bad, but it's so long. And I'm listening to the audiobook, and if you're going to read Lord of the Rings, I'd recommend the audiobook because it's a lot easier, because it does very much have that kind of spoken word story quality. I find A Song of Ice and Fire is also really good when you hear it out loud, especially if there's a good narrator who kind of does some voice acting. But the downside of that is you have to endure all the songs, and that is something that I distinctly remembered upon the first like couple hours of this, is how many of these obnoxious songs there are. And I'm sure there's people who like them. They say it's part of the lore. And they'll be like, Argent, but you like the songs in A Song of Ice and Fire, at least some of them. Yeah, but there's not nearly as many of them, and they're kind of more recognizable. Like there's kind of like a three staple songs they normally have in A Song of Ice and Fire: the Dornish Man's Wife, the Rains of Castamere, and the Bear in the Main Fair. And there's some others, but they don't really show up nearly as often. Like in the first like 3 or 4 hours of this book, we have like 7 or 8 songs, and Tom Bombadil speaks entirely in song. So in like his couple chapters alone, we have like 7 or 8 of them, and I just find them really obnoxious because I'm trying to read the book, and then all of a sudden like characters just start singing, and it just wastes a page or two. And I've kind of made a bet to myself to not skip, because I think what happened when I first read this, and this is what happens, and I've talked to a lot of people, they start reading it, they're like, oh, okay, I like the part in the Shire, I like the part about Bilbo, and then they get to the forest, and the forest is like a quarter of the book, just them wandering through it with nothing happening. And a lot of people just quit at that point. They just bored quit Lord of the Rings. And it's funny because like there'll people who will really sing the book's praise and say like this is the best book ever. It's the greatest series ever. It's the greatest Christian book series ever. And then like, did you read them? They're like, I got about 5 chapters in and gave up. I mean, because it gets better once you get past that. But it's like, as the creator of a fictional work, why would you do that at the beginning? Like just have a massive stream of nothingness. And I'm just complaining because that was my experience as a kid. I was so excited. I was starting to read it. I'm like, oh, this is really cool. I'm really enjoying this. And then you just hit a wall. And that kind of was my reading experience with a lot of Lord of the Rings. Is I'd just be reading it. I'd like a lot of it, but then it would just get bogged down in like excessive descriptive writing, songs, feasting scenes, and George R. R. Martin's bad for this too. I think just by the point that I had gotten to read his books, I just gotten used to skipping. So I recall I did that a lot when I was a kid and I was reading these. I just started after a while skipping pages. So like anytime they were eating, I'd just skip a couple pages. If they were singing, I'd skip a couple pages. If they were debating the merits of a certain tobacco or cannabis or whatever the hell they're always smoking, I would skip a couple pages, and that made the book series a lot better. And to be fair, one of the reasons I like A Song of Ice and Fire so much is there's a lot of POVs I just skip. Like I'd skip Bran, normally Dany, I generally skip Sam, the Iron Isles, and Dorne, and Arya. So I skipped basically like everything that wasn't directly related to the main story. So I enjoyed it a lot more because of that. And when I was reading Lord of the Rings initially, I would just skip through a lot of it. And I can see why. And it's just like, I get that we're not allowed to criticize the almighty J.R.R. Tolkien, but honestly, I think the guy could have really used an editor. Because there's some people like Michael Bay or Zack Schneider who do have a lot of talent. And I'm sure people get angry then comparing J.R.R. Tolkien to Michael Bay, but they have a lot of talent. It's just they need to be on a leash. They need someone to stand there next to them and hold them a leash and just go bat. Like whenever Michael Bay wants to put in like African American robots or like random dick jokes or stuff like that. Like he just needs somebody there to just smack him and be like with a spritzer bottle, down Michael, down. And I kind of feel like Tolkien really needed that. Like he really needed someone to just take a chainsaw to these books and just be like, dude, you gotta just stop. You gotta just like get some of this out. And I've already seen people criticizing me on some other platforms saying, well, you just don't have the patience. He's doing world building. He's doing lore. He's not writing an action adventure story. Okay, well, I do think it kind of is a bit of an event. It is an adventure story, but point taken. But to be fair, like a year or two after I read Lord of the Rings, I read Dune. And Dune was like the most amazing thing I'd ever read. Dune is actually my favorite book, by the way. Second favorite is probably Darth Plagueis. I think that says something. But no, I love Dune. I read Dune like, I think I read the whole book in like a week and I reread it like 3 or 4 times. And I love that. And there's not always a lot of action in Dune. A lot of Dune is just very internal dialogue. If you've read No Chance, my book, my writing style is very much inspired by Frank Herbert. I'd say he's probably my main literary influence. But no, I love Dune. And Dune has a lot of like dialogue or just people analyzing their feelings or like intrigue and all kinds of like lore and stuff. And I ate all that up. I loved The Song of Ice and Fire. I've read the side books. I read A World of Ice and Fire, and I loved it. I think I read that twice. And I'm on my second reading of Fire and Blood. And I love that. And that's just lore. That's just like a history. But I think that's kind of different. Same thing with something like Star Wars, because that's, I guess, a bit more focused. And some of that, not all of that is, yeah, I don't really know. It's just something about Tolkien. I don't know if it's just the way he deliberately tries to make things more abstract or less. I don't know. It's a certain something just with his writing that's just never really clicked with me. And I'm really getting that impression again. So I'll do a separate video about the political and religious kind of background of Lord of the Rings and kind of the fan base and that sort of thing. But it's just kind of always been a thing over the years as I've been surrounded by people who are huge Tolkien fans, who love Tolkien, who talk about him all the time, who say he's the greatest author of all time. And I've always kind of been the guy there who's the contrarian. He's just like, I didn't really like these books that much. There was good stuff in it. But like, is it fair to say that these are a good book series when like a third of it is just like stuff that could have been cut and had no impact whatsoever on the storytelling? Like it's not like they like, if it's when I'm complaining about is, I'm not complaining about like if they're talking about, I don't know, the fall of Numenor, they're talking about like Smeagol, or they're talking about like Sauron's backstory or like Elrond's like that's all fine. That's like relevant to the book. I don't need instant gratification. I don't need them to like be doing Matrix moves with like crossbows fighting Nazgul like every 5 seconds. But I also can't take like 4 chapters of them wandering around a forest with Tom Bombadil like singing random like I just can't. It's just it stops the flow. Like let's say you were playing a narrative based game that doesn't really have much action. So let's think of something like Amnesia: The Dark Descent. So you're playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and like every hour somebody comes up to you, takes the controller away, and dances around singing some lame song. and then gives the controller back to you. Like, does that help the flow? Does that help the pacing? No, it really doesn't. So that's kind of, I guess you could say, just for a first video, the background on my thoughts on the whole thing. I have a number of videos I want to do on this. A lot of them very positive, because there are, I think, a lot of things in this that I really do like, and that I think other works of fiction can take a page out of. No pun intended. So that's kind of the first video. Thank you for enduring my rambling. This is Argent. We must